Welcome. I'm a narrative researcher. Brené Brown once said, maybe stories are just data with a soul. I'm interested in our stories, the stories we tell of our lives in the context we live and of the ways in which we engage in our lives. Our stories are only stories unless we contextualize them and we explore responsibility and consider the agency, the capacity and the extent of our response. Narrative research is developed through writing, speaking, listening and reflecting. This presentation provides a methodological platform in itself. So can I ask you to do something for me? Make any notes and text me, email, and tell me what you think. What thoughts come up for you during this? What questions? What are your responses to my presentation? And we know, as researchers, that research often starts with a stone in the shoe. I can't see your shoes, and you can't see mine. That's online engagement for you. So we have to choose how much to share and what to share. Shall I put on some old slippers to be with you? Or my red suede Chelsea boots? Which ones are the real me? Do they tell different stories? Probably. And what kind of shoes am I dreaming of next when lockdown ends? Well, who knows what shoes I might be wearing next time you see me? We develop our life narratives through our conversations, our reflections, the way we present ourselves, our writing and much more. Drawing upon our individual and collective past, these narratives help position us in the present and equip us for our future. This narrative capital can provide affordances, but can also restrict or even burden us. Narrative inquiry seeks to explore such processes and provides a vehicle for researching the lived experiences and life histories of individuals and social collective groups. Through the semi-structured interview process, the research participant relationship becomes a site for collaborative inquiry and co-constructed analysis. Shared writing, reflective discourses via email, for example, may complement this process or method. Drawing upon the work of John Heron and Peter Reason, participatory inquiry, Ivor Goodson, narrative inquiry, Jane Speedy, psychotherapeutic and textual inquiry, Bochner and Carolyn Ellis, autoethnography, and my own work, my own narrative. This session will explore narrative inquiry's methodology and the use of associated narrative research methods and processes. Many people have written and worked extensively with narrative, and narrative inquiry is now a thing, part of the canon, and a recognised body of work exists with clearer, more authoritative voices than mine. And so I will give a little of their voices first, the voices that speak clearest to me. We develop our life narratives through our conversations, our reflections, the way we present ourselves, our writing, and much more. When positioned as research methodology, narrative inquiry is fundamentally a relational process. Whilst researcher and participant roles may be defined formally, the researcher brings their own narrative to the research relationship, and the participant brings their own self-inquiry sensibility. This interrelationship, this ebb and flow between the two, is central to the narrative inquiry process. Narrative methodologies embrace a range of processes and positions. Speedy explores the key themes of reflexivity and liminality in relation to narrative inquiry when she notes that we are continuously engaging in the spaces that which is known and that which is not yet known. Hence the nature of narratives of belonging and becoming, identifying and edifying, forming and reforming, evoking and evolving can be considered to be autoethnographical. We choose and use words to represent our changing experience, truth and meaning. Goodson and Hargreaves and Day et al., amongst others, note that professional identities themselves are constructed from the process of changing professional practice situated in the context of personal experiences, culture, values and identities. This process of professional formation and reformation and repositioning involves such a shift between personal and professional experiences, practices and identities. It requires participants to reconstruct their own personalised narrative in relation to border and/or boundary crossing. Hence, the approach taken in sites of narrative inquiry is often a collaborative process of co-construction. Data collection, participants reflecting on their own motivations and experiences, and data analysis, further collaborative analysis of the narratives, at times interweave through the dialogical relationship. And to quote Margaret Atwood, context is everything. Sugrue and Solbrecht's text is 10 years old now, but how our lives have been altered, fractured and contested over recent times. And within this, narratives crack and reform, disrupt and are disrupted, troubled and troubling. So what does it look like? Here are two narrative works. In the first, I'm in dialogue with youth practitioners as they explore their professional narratives, their stories of self and rebecoming during times of social political upheaval. In the second, this is my story, an account of my response to Brexit through a reconceptualised repositioning of my relationship with my father. The narratives are stories in context. The key is in the representation of voice and in the meaning we take from this, the resonance and understanding the narratives evoke. So this is taken directly from the first of these narrative papers. Participants were interviewed twice. The first scoping interview was based broadly on, tell me your story. How did you become to be working within young people's services? What is it that makes you who you are professionally? Interviews lasted for approximately 80 to 90 minutes. My questioning, reflection and clarification responded directly to the focus and direction of each participant's presenting narrative. Following the first interview, the transcribed text was sent to the participant, who was asked to reflect further on themes discussed and consider starting points for the next interview. In particular, participants were asked to consider how their practice, identity and professionality had developed in recent times, with thoughts for their future development. This then provided the foci for a second interview, following which the process of transcription and collaborative reflection and analysis was repeated. Finally, narrative portrayals for each practitioner were constructed, again through a negotiated dialogical process, drawing on the two interview transcripts and subsequent email exchanges as primary data. The portrayals developed were constructed temporarily, from looking back to looking forward, with professionality as a central driving theme. I was not a neutral interviewer. Interpretations and analyses were developed and explored collaboratively, usually in the sense of considering and negotiating connections between narrative threads. My own background as a teacher, youth worker, psychotherapist and university tutor informed the approach taken as a researcher here. Hence, a co-construction process was utilised. The narratives upon which this paper is based are likely to have evolved differently with a different researcher. In this way, my own narrative capital inevitably comes to the process of co-construction, and the participants have become to know me, and so respond to me, individually, in ways that they do differently had Jonathan interviewed them. In the second of the two articles, my narrative is a reflective one, of trying to make some sense of relationships from years ago and their resonance and meaning in relation to a different time, a different context. This meaning making is multi-layered and intertextual. My dad was a conscientious objector. He wouldn't fight. It's embarrassing. I know that, but if truth be told, I'm not sure why. And so I take the coward's way out, avoid conflict, I dodge the issue, avoid the truth. I can't swim. I go to Sunday school. My dad was a conscientious objector. It's embarrassing. As I grew up, I stopped going to Sunday school, thankfully, and my embarrassment broadens into a generalised discomfort of feeling that I don't fit in. But by adopting strategies which camouflage this, I mimic, I ape, I pretend that I do fit in, and it seems to work. There's a group at school that I'm sort of part of. I hover at the fringes. Do I really like Led Zeppelin? Should I take physics or drama? Is she really going out with him? I learned that by not taking a stance, I can hedge my bets and keep my options open. I avoid rejection, but I feel like I never really experience acceptance or belonging, or defining myself. I talk a little more with my dad. He's not embarrassed, but he's not proud either. He talks about his experience, his faith, and his decision to take a very personal, individual stance. And I think I begin to understand a little. But I certainly don't talk about it to anyone at school. One of the things that strikes me is Dad's complete assuredness about his faith and about his decision to refuse to fight. How did he know it was the right thing to do? How could he be that certain? What does this story mean to you? How do you respond as you hear me reading this, telling you my story? How we collect data, remember Brené Brown's quote about stories being data with soul, is a subtle process in narrative inquiry. It's a gentle engagement, but it does have focus. And being transparent about this focus is important. As researchers, we don't come to the research interview neutrally. It's possible we have our own version, our own story, our own narrative, and this is likely to have been a significant part of our motivation, our impetus for the research. In which case, my advice is always tell your story. Write it out and know that it is your story and that others' stories may well have similar elements, but equally they may be very different. My friend Rochelle is researching teachers' experiences of surveillance. But of course, experiences of surveillance are different, and our understandings of what constitutes surveillance may wildly differ. Rochelle has her own experiences and understandings, and she brings these to her research. But she also wants to hear and receive others' experiences and understandings, and so has to manage this process with care and sensitivity. It's where a research journal and good supervisors come into their own. And so we have to tread gently as we find a place to question and respond, listen, and at times direct the data collection process. The opening interview is key. Be open, but be clear about your voice and rationale. Practice what turns of phrase seem to work best for you. This is semi-structured interviewing, but if there's a continuum between tightly structured and totally unstructured, it's towards the latter end of this spectrum. And interview more than once. Send a transcript of the first interview to the participant to encourage reflection, and at the beginning of the second interview, ask the participant where they'd like to start. Go with the flow, but maintain touch with your own research focus and rationale, and be prepared gently to bring the participant back towards the focus if need be. In developing their narrative, telling their story, the participant explores meaning, develops meaning. In this way, the process of narrative inquiry becomes closer to participatory inquiry. The participant becomes a researcher, a co-researcher into their own narrative capital. An example of this is when Jackie from the first study reflects on and relates an incident from her practice. In bringing this to our interview, to the research process, Jackie builds her narrative capital, which then becomes woven into the professional she wants to be. And I then present this from Jackie within my research as an illustration of Jackie's developing professionality, and position it alongside other illustrative examples from other professional narratives. And later, I present it within this session on narrative inquiry. But this is still Jackie's story, Jackie's narrative. And so this brings us to issues of authenticity, ethical credibility, and professional responsibility. Jackie isn't here to share her narrative with you, and so I have a duty, responsibility, to present Jackie with integrity, truth and meaning. What would Jackie say if she were here with us now? I have to imagine and honour her professionality, her narrative. At one level, of course, I'm exploiting Jackie. Is this okay? This meaning making, the narrative analysis, happens both within the interview process and at a distance, and is shaped back and forth between interviewer and interviewee. It becomes woven into the cloth of the research, the text of the thesis. And we choose where to bring the light of our analysis to rest on, to represent in our narrative inquiry. This focus of analysis then is positioned at the intersection between the researcher and the participant. But it's our choice. It's our choice where to place that focus of analysis, how to develop our thesis. In writing and rewriting, we then see this process as being in flux through and between a number of considerations. And that in the development of narrative, there is a shape-shifting quality between the individual, the social and the structural, between reality, meaning and truth, of power, context and discourse, validity, rigour and authenticity, with the awareness of issues of reflexivity and being an insider researcher underlying all of this. And through all this meaning making, we return to context and our understanding of context, the personal, social, relational, structural, the fluid and nomadic, the dialogical and the relational. And so we have narrative inquiry as methodology, where the aim usually is to present a narrative account of someone, drawing largely on their words. But even here there is an editing process, choosing elements, sections and quotes to present a form of their narrative. This editing process is an analytical and meaning-making process. As a researcher, we are making decisions, and of course the narrator may or may not play a part in those decisions, the editing and meaning-making. Within the narrative inquiry process, it's usual to present narratives in the form of portrayals. We provide biographical and contextual details. Again, there are choices here, but these details are important. They frame and give depth to the narrative. Jackie is not Jackie's real name. She chose Jackie. I wonder why. Why Jackie? Perhaps this choice itself is part of her narrative. We might also include mini-narratives, mini-portrayals as part of case studies, for example, again giving depth to the context under study. And finally, we might present our own narrative within the context of research or reflexivity. This is something I often encourage my students to do, to write their own narrative early on in the research process, and to come back to it as a point of reflexivity. To conclude then, there is great responsibility and privilege, I feel, in exploring and engaging with others in the telling of their narratives. A narrative might be someone's grand opus, or a coat worn for comfort and familiarity. It might be protective, or cast on and cast off with a casual air. We may never know which. But we come to develop our understanding of the social relational context through the lived lives of those prepared to share their memories, dreams and reflections. And sometimes too we become more insightful with regard to our own narrative and the way that we carry and represent this in our own interactions and meaning makings. Thank you.